What's up friends, my name is Jess, welcome to my channel, and welcome to another tag video. Today I'm going to be doing the meta book tag, which was created by one of my really good friends, Delphi from the Oracle of Delphi. She tagged me in this months and months ago, in 2020 I'm almost certain, so I love you, Delphi. I finally did it. This is a pretty fun tag where each tag is a different type of book and the tag is based on that type of— you'll see. I don't even know how I'm trying to explain this. You'll see. We're just gonna start. So the first one is middle grade, your childhood favorite book. I have a lot of childhood favorite books that I'm sure everyone has heard about. You know, A Series of Unfortunate Events is one of my favorites. Who hasn't heard about that? So I wanted to pick a book that I never hear people talk about, so maybe a lot of people don't know what it is. And that book is Kathy's book by— I don't even really know who by, because the authors listed are Stuart, Wiseman, and Brigg. So I don't really know who the main author is, but if you look up Kathy's book, it should show up. This book basically follows this girl named Kathy, who's your regular teenage girl, except she ends up meeting this guy who she just is head over heels for. She's really into him, they're having a great relationship, but some things just aren't quite adding up. I don't want to say more than that because I think it's just better if you read the book and find out about it, but the format of this book is actually as if this is Kathy's diary and she's meeting this guy for the first time and she's collecting evidence, so to speak, into all of the discrepancies with him and his life story. So it's a bunch of diary entries, things that she's doing, and it's really fun because you have kind of doodles in there. I don't know if you can see it. You have transcripts. She is an artist, so you see a lot of different kinds of drawings. You have underlined parts, little notations in the margins, that's the word. But the reason that I love this book actually is not because of the story. It's not like one of the best stories I've ever read in the world, but the reason why I love it is because it has a bunch of interactive elements to it. You get a whole pouch of different props of sort that come up throughout the story. So for instance, you have this ripped up photograph that has a phone number on it. I'm missing the fourth piece of it, but I don't know where that is. You have this wedding invitation, a restaurant menu that's like actually a restaurant menu. You have a bunch of news articles, a bunch of drawings by Kathy, there's a death certificate, and my favorite is this little napkin with a kiss mark on it that says "See you on Tuesday." I'm a sucker for interactive features, so I love being able to physically hold the things that are in this book. So that's a really cool book. Next up, we have YA, a hyped book that lived up to the expectations, and for this I chose The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I'm sure if you watch BookTube regularly, you've heard of this book before. People hyped it up for months after it came out, and they were right. Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo follows this woman who is a reporter who one day receives the opportunity of a lifetime. Evelyn Hugo, who was a major Hollywood starlet back in the 60s, has never ever done an interview. She has never told people about her life. For some reason, she has decided that she finally wants to do a tell-all interview of her life. And she has chosen our main character, basically a nobody in the magazine world, to tell her story. So that's what we're doing. We're following their conversation, their interview, as we learn about Evelyn Hugo's life, and as of course we learn about the 7 husbands that she had throughout her lifetime. This book is so good. It is so good. It's such an emotional roller coaster. There's actually like a really big question of morality and what it means to be a good person, because Evelyn Hugo isn't really, you know, a good person, but she's not a bad person either. There's some morally great things that she's done in her life. So it's just such a good book. I think Taylor Jenkins Reid does morally gray really, really well and shows how humans make mistakes all the time and they do things that aren't necessarily good, but it's just the flaws of humanity, essentially. It's so good. And there's a particular part of the book that I so love, but I'm not going to mention it. If you've watched enough BookTube, you probably know what the twist is, but in case you haven't, I don't want to mention it because it's so much better if you don't know going in. But I love The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. Next up, we have New Adult, a book you had your doubts about. Basically any book that I mention in one of my Purging My Shelves video would fit this prompt because it's books that I was like iffy on, enough that I didn't want to just unhaul them, but I still chose them for my Purging My Shelves video because I thought I would probably get rid of them. But as a real answer that doesn't involve any of those books, I'm gonna say The Bride Test by Helen Huang, because I went into that book not expecting to like it at all, because romance just is not the genre for me. It's not my favorite genre. I read the book for my Reading Romance Until I Like It video, so you can get more of my thoughts on that, but it was an unexpected book for me. I had my doubts because I don't really like romance, and I also don't really like romance that has a bunch of sex scenes in it. Not because I'm uncomfortable with it, but because, like, I don't care. It doesn't do anything for me, so to me, it just takes time away from the plot. But I really enjoyed The Bride Test. I thought it was really fun, and I didn't mind any of the sex scenes, so I ended up enjoying it more than I thought. So if you've never heard of The Bride Test, essentially what it is, we have our main character who is a cleaning lady abroad. I want to say that she's Korean or Vietnamese. I can't remember now. I think she's Vietnamese, and she works in Vietnam as a cleaning lady, and she runs into a woman one day who tells her that she is looking for a bride for her son. Conversation ensues, and essentially our main character agrees to fly to America for a month, and in that month try to make this woman's son fall in love with her and agree to marry her. It was pretty fun. Loved that we had some representation of somebody who is not American, and you kind of get a little bit of the immigration point of view of someone trying to acclimate to a new world and have to deal with the fact that they don't really know the language and they don't know the culture and things like that. There's also really good autism representation because the main love interest has autism. The author herself does as well. It's really good. It's awesome representation. It's a really good book. If you want more of my thoughts on it, watch the Reading Romance Until I Like It video. All right, the next question is adult, a book that intimidates you. My first instinct for this was to put The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. Now, here's the reason why. I really, really want to read The Poppy War. I haven't read it yet because I want physical copies to be able to read it physically. It's such a massive story that I don't feel comfortable listening to an audiobook, and I want to be able to annotate it to really get involved with the story, so I want it physically. But I'm intimidated, one, because it's a massive trilogy. The books are really, really big. But I'm also intimidated because there's such a deep historical context to it, and it's a very serious historical context to it. Off the top of my head, I don't remember the historical events that this book was based off of, but if you look it up, you can find it for sure. I want to be able to go into this book having knowledge of those historical events so that I can see what the author did, see what she intended to do, and be able to absorb this story in a respectful manner. There is a nonfiction book that details those historical events that this book was based off of that I think the author herself recommended, and I do plan on reading that book. I want to read that one first before I read The Poppy War. That's a reason why it intimidates me. I just don't want to read the book and then not do the historical context of it justice or be respectful. All right, and next up we have fantasy, an atmospheric book that transports you. I had to say The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. I don't even remember the book anymore because I read it, gosh, after freshman year of college, I think. So it's been a long time, but even now, when I think atmospheric, I think of The Night Circus. So if you've never heard of The Night Circus, it's a pretty old book. It's been talked about on booktube a lot, but essentially what the story is you have two magicians who are pitted against each other in a battle for their lives. And their main stage for this battle is the Night Circus, which is a circus that only appears at night mysteriously and then disappears in the day, travels to no rhyme or reason that people can see. It sounds really epic when you put it that way, but in actuality, it's a very subtle, fantastical sort of battle where it's essentially these two magicians trying to one-up each other in this circus and try to show that their magic is better. And it ends up evolving into a love story. It's so beautiful. It's atmospheric. I can't remember the details of it, but I remember the way that the book made me feel. I was enraptured. The writing style of it captured me. I don't think I even cared what the story was because the writing style, the way things were described was just so beautiful. Whenever I think of atmospheric, I think of The Night Circus. Next up we have Sci-Fi, a book that taught you something. This was a really, really hard question for me to answer because every book that I read teaches me something, even if it's super minuscule, even if it's just something about myself. I ended up going with The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo by Stieg Larsson. This is an old series. It's the Millennium series. I read this back when I was maybe 14 14, maybe younger. I credit this book with being the book that made me realize how much I enjoy crime fiction. The basic premise of this book is that we have our main character, Michael, who is a disgraced journalist. He ended up going to jail for libel, but in actuality, it was a trap set for him. He was intentionally fed information that he couldn't later prove so that he would end up going to jail. So he's been disgraced and he needs to figure out a way to improve his reputation. So when the patriarch of one of the richest families in Sweden goes to him and says that he wants Michael's help to find Harriet, one of the family members who disappeared 40 years ago, Michael says yes. And he enlists the help of Lisbeth, who is punky and edgy and morally gray, tends to take justice into her own hands, but she is a genius. I love Lisbeth. So that's what the premise of this story is. It gets kind of, not gory, it gets kind of graphic sometimes, kind of violent sometimes, but this was the book that made me realize that I enjoy crime fiction. I kind of enjoy mysteries and trying to figure things out. And more so, I think this book might have been the one that inspired me to go into journalism, because I had a lot of respect for what journalists did in this story, even though it's not an accurate representation of what a journalist does in the day-to-day, especially because it's all scandalous. I think this book did partially teach me that I cared a lot about journalism and I thought that he was doing important work. The next prompt is a thriller, a book you couldn't put down, and for that I chose The Lunar Chronicles by Marissa Meyer. This is the first book, Cinder. If you've never heard of The Lunar Chronicles, it's a pretty popular YA series. They're all fairy tale retellings, so of course, as you can tell from this is Cinderella, but this takes place in a futuristic world where there's a bunch of technological advancements, and in this story, our Cinderella is actually a cyborg. Now that's already interesting enough, but this story actually follows Cinder as she meets the prince, but unfortunately cyborgs are discriminated against in this society. There are other issues. There is a disease that's rampant throughout the world. There's some political corruption going on. There are conspiracies. To me, it's a very good series. It's really, really entertaining. This series reminded me of why I love to read. Now I kind of consider them comfort books. It was just so fun. I loved seeing how the fairy tale elements were taken and put into these books. All right, and the final prompt is contemporary, a book you could relate to. For that prompt, I chose Radio Silence by Alice Oseman. This book follows Frances, who is your typical overachiever in high school, except for the fact that she secretly makes fan art for her favorite podcast called Universe City. One day, Frances gets a message from Radio Silence, the host of Universe City, and she gets the amazing opportunity to make official art for each episode of the podcast, and through that, she figures out that Aled Last, another boy in her school, is actually the anonymous host of the podcast. The two spend an entire summer building their friendship and getting really close to each other, but when Aled's identity is revealed to the world, their friendship might be at risk. I loved this book. It's not typically the kind of book that I would really enjoy because I don't really enjoy YA contemporaries, and more than that, this is a very character-driven book, and that's not always my favorite thing either, but I really identified with some of the problems here. One of which is that our characters are in their final years of high school, or they have just graduated and they're going to college, and that's such a huge identity crisis of going on to the next step of your life and not knowing what that next step is going to be. Not knowing if college is the right next step for you, even though everyone in your life is telling you that you have to go to college in order to be successful. And it's just so many emotions that I understand. I understand what it's like to be an overachiever in school and feel that pressure to be perfect, and I understand what it's like to just not know what you're going to do with your life and not knowing what the next best step is. I just emotionally related to this a lot, and I really loved it. Okay, and that is the end of the tag. I hope y'all enjoyed watching this and hearing my answers to these prompts. Now, to pick a few people to tag: Nicole from Nicole Reads, Stephanie from Stephanie Bookish, Rachel from Let Me in the Library, Ebony from Butterflies on My Bookshelf, and whoever else wants to do this video, feel free to do it. I had a lot of fun doing this tag. I am so sorry, Delphi, that it took me so long to do it, but I'm glad that I finally did. Please make sure to like and comment below. I would love to hear your thoughts on the books that I talked about, what your own answers would be, and if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to my channel. I do try to put a video out every single week. I will see you in the next one.